Few civilizations have shaped the modern world as profoundly as Rome, and yet its beginnings were so small, so fragile, that its survival was never guaranteed. Long before Rome ruled an empire stretching from Britain to the deserts of Syria, it was nothing more than a collection of huts perched on muddy hills beside a shallow river that flooded without warning. The astonishing truth is that Rome's rise was not inevitable. For centuries, it hovered on the edge of obscurity, vulnerable to famine, invasion, and internal collapse. That it endured at all is one of history's greatest improbabilities. According to Roman tradition, the city was founded in 753 BCE, a date preserved by later historians such as Livy and Varro. The legend tells of twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, abandoned at birth, raised by a she-wolf, and destined to found a city. Romulus would kill Remus in a dispute over power, becoming Rome's first king and establishing a city born in violence. While modern historians reject the literal truth of this story, its symbolism is revealing. Romans believed conflict, struggle, and bloodshed were embedded in their origins. Archaeology confirms that by the 8th century BCE, settlements existed on the Palatine Hill, though these were not yet a city in any modern sense. They were small agrarian communities living among more powerful neighbors such as the Etruscans to the north and the Greek colonies to the south. Rome lacked natural defenses, rich soil, or major trade advantages. By every conventional measure, it should have failed. Yet Rome possessed one quiet advantage: adaptability. From its earliest days, Rome absorbed ideas, practices, and people from surrounding cultures. Etruscan kings introduced monumental architecture, religious rituals, and political symbolism. Latin traditions shaped social organization. Greek influence filtered in through trade and warfare. Rome did not resist foreign ideas, it weaponized them. Early Rome was ruled by kings, some legendary, some likely historical. Figures such as Tarquinius Priscus and Servius Tullius were credited with building walls, reorganizing society, and expanding political participation. Yet monarchy never sat comfortably with Roman values. Power concentrated in a single ruler conflicted with elite families who feared tyranny. In 509 BCE, Rome overthrew its last king, Tarquinius Superbus, and established a republic. According to Livy, this moment was not simply a political shift, but a moral revolution. Romans defined themselves thereafter by what they were not. They were not subjects, not ruled by kings, not passive. Freedom became a civic obsession. The Roman Republic was built on a complex system designed to prevent any one individual from seizing total power. Authority was divided among annually elected magistrates, chief among them the consuls. The Senate, composed of elite men from powerful families, wielded enormous influence. Popular assemblies gave ordinary male citizens a voice, though that voice was weighted heavily in favor of the wealthy. This system was not democratic in the modern sense. It was hierarchical, competitive, and deeply unequal. Yet it proved remarkably resilient. Rome survived internal tension by institutionalizing conflict rather than suppressing it. Political rivalry was expected. Ambition was celebrated. What mattered was that competition occurred within agreed rules. But even in its early centuries, Rome was never peaceful. Survival required constant warfare. Surrounded by rival Latin cities, Etruscans, and later Samnites and Gauls, Rome fought relentlessly. Defeat meant destruction. Victory meant land, slaves, and security. Over time, warfare became the engine of Roman expansion and social cohesion. One of Rome's most significant innovations was how it treated defeated enemies. Rather than annihilating them, Rome often incorporated them. Conquered peoples might receive partial citizenship, military obligations, or political rights over time. This policy, noted by historians such as Polybius, allowed Rome to expand its manpower base while binding former enemies to its success. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome controlled most of the Italian peninsula. This expansion was not planned. It emerged through reactive warfare, alliances, and opportunistic conquest. Rome did not initially seek empire. It stumbled into dominance by refusing to accept defeat. The defining moment of early Roman history came with the Punic Wars against Carthage, a wealthy maritime empire in North Africa. These wars transformed Rome from a regional power into a Mediterranean superpower. The struggle was existential. Carthage threatened Rome's survival, and Rome responded with unprecedented mobilization. The Second Punic War, marked by the legendary campaigns of Hannibal, pushed Rome to the brink. Entire Roman armies were annihilated, cities defected. Italy itself became a battlefield. Yet Rome refused to negotiate. As Polybius observed, Rome's strength lay not in avoiding defeat, but in enduring it. Victory over Carthage in 146 BCE marked a turning point. Rome emerged dominant, but changed. Wealth flooded in. Slaves poured across Italy. Old social balances collapsed. The republic that had been built for a city-state now governed an empire it was never designed to control. Ancient writers were acutely aware of this transformation. Sallust argued that moral decay followed success, that luxury replaced discipline, and ambition turned corrosive. Modern historians such as Mary Beard and Adrian Goldsworthy echo this assessment, noting that Rome's institutions struggled to manage inequality and scale. By the late 2nd century BCE, Rome stood at a crossroads. It had conquered the Mediterranean, but lost control over its own political equilibrium. Reformers demanded land redistribution and social justice. Elites resisted. Violence entered politics. The Republic's safeguards began to fail. Rome's greatest era was also the beginning of its most dangerous phase. And this raises the central question that will guide the rest of this documentary. How did a system designed to prevent tyranny produce emperors, civil war, and eventual collapse? How did a city built on shared power come to accept absolute rule? And how did Rome endure, in some form, for over 1,000 years after the Republic's fall? In the next part, we will follow Rome as it expands beyond Italy, conquers the Mediterranean, and begins to fracture under the weight of its own success, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic political transformations in human history. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Rome had achieved what no Mediterranean power before it ever had. Its legions had crushed Carthage, subdued Greece, and extended Roman influence from Spain to Asia Minor. To an outside observer, Rome appeared unstoppable. But inside the Republic, the very victories that made Rome great were quietly dismantling the system that had sustained it for centuries. The problem was scale. Rome's political institutions had been designed for a city-state governing a small territory in central Italy. They were never meant to administer a sprawling empire filled with millions of non-citizens, enormous wealth disparities, and armies that spent years campaigning far from home. The Republic did not expand its structure to match its power, and the consequences were profound. Conquest flooded Rome with wealth on an unprecedented scale. Gold, silver, slaves, and land poured into Italy, but this wealth did not distribute evenly. Much of it concentrated in the hands of the senatorial elite, who purchased vast estates known as latifundia, worked by enslaved laborers captured in war. Small farmers, who had once formed the backbone of Rome's citizen army, were steadily pushed off their land. Military service kept them away for years, and when they returned, they found their farms ruined or bought out. This shift destabilized Roman society at its core. As described by Plutarch, Italy began to fill with displaced citizens who owned nothing but their citizenship. They crowded into Rome itself, dependent on patronage, public handouts, and political favor. At the same time, the army increasingly relied on poorer men who had little stake in the republic beyond the promise of pay and land. The Senate, dominated by aristocratic families, largely ignored these changes. Senators benefited enormously from conquest and saw little reason to reform a system that rewarded them so richly. But pressure mounted, and in 133 BCE, it erupted into open political crisis. That year, a tribune of the people named Tiberius Gracchus proposed land reforms intended to restore small farms to Roman citizens. His argument was simple and dangerous. Rome could not survive if its citizens were dispossessed, its army weakened, and its wealth monopolized by a few. He appealed directly to the people, bypassing the Senate, and challenged elite authority in a way that shocked the political establishment. The response was brutal. Tiberius was beaten to death by a group of senators and their supporters in what Appian describes as the first major act of political violence within the city in centuries. His murder marked a turning point. From this moment on, violence became an accepted political tool. A decade later, his brother Gaius Gracchus attempted broader reforms, including subsidized grain for the poor and changes to provincial governance. He, too, was killed, along with thousands of his followers. The Republic survived these crises, but it was permanently scarred. The rules that had restrained ambition and preserved compromise were eroding. As internal tensions grew, Rome's military system was also changing. In the late 2nd century BCE, the general Gaius Marius reformed the army by allowing landless citizens to enlist. This solved Rome's manpower problem, but created a new one. Soldiers now depended on their generals for pay, plunder, and retirement land. Loyalty shifted away from the state and toward individual commanders. This transformation would prove fatal to the Republic. By the early 1st century BCE, Roman politics had become a battleground of rival elites backed by armed force. Generals accumulated unprecedented power through foreign wars, while the Senate struggled to control them. Civil war loomed not as a possibility, but as an inevitability. The first major rupture came with Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a general who marched his army on Rome itself in 88 BCE, an act previously unthinkable. Sulla seized power, purged his enemies, and ruled as dictator. Although he later resigned and attempted to restore traditional institutions, his actions shattered the taboo against using military force in domestic politics. Roman writers understood the significance immediately. As Cicero lamented, the Republic now existed in name, but not in spirit. Ambition no longer needed justification. Power no longer needed legitimacy beyond strength. In the decades that followed, Rome was dominated by larger-than-life figures whose personal rivalries shaped history. Pompey the Great gained immense popularity through military success in the East. Crassus amassed staggering wealth. Julius Caesar emerged as a brilliant commander and political operator. Together, they formed an informal alliance known as the First Triumvirate, bypassing the Senate and concentrating power in private hands. This arrangement exposed the final weakness of the Republic. Its institutions could not contain men who commanded armies, wealth, and popular support simultaneously. When the alliance collapsed, civil war followed. In 49 BCE, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with his army, an act that symbolized open rebellion against the Senate. According to Suetonius, Caesar knew the meaning of his action. The Republic's laws no longer constrained those powerful enough to ignore them. The civil war that followed ended with Caesar's victory and his appointment as dictator for life. His reforms stabilized Rome temporarily, addressing debt, citizenship, and provincial governance. But his concentration of power terrified the Senate. In 44 BCE, Caesar was assassinated by men who claimed to defend the Republic. Instead, they sealed its fate. What followed was not restoration, but chaos. Further civil wars tore the Roman world apart, culminating in the rise of Octavian, later known as Augustus. In defeating his rivals, Augustus achieved what no Roman before him had done. He ended civil war while keeping absolute power. Yet he did so carefully, preserving the outward forms of the Republic. Magistracies continued. The Senate met. Laws were passed. But real authority rested with one man. As Tacitus later observed, Romans accepted imperial rule not because they loved monarchy, but because they were exhausted by instability. Peace became more valuable than freedom. And with that acceptance, Rome entered a new phase of its history. The Republic was dead, not by overthrow, but by exhaustion. In its place rose an empire that would dominate the ancient world for centuries. In the next part, we will follow the transformation of Rome under Augustus, examining how imperial rule reshaped politics, society, and identity, and why the Roman Empire endured far longer than the Republic ever did. When the dust of civil war finally settled, Rome was exhausted in a way no foreign enemy had ever managed to achieve. For nearly a century, violence had erupted again and again, not at the borders of the Republic, but at its heart. Armies marched on Rome itself. Senators were murdered in the streets. Laws were rewritten by force and erased just as quickly. By the time Octavian emerged as the last man standing, Romans no longer asked whether power should be concentrated in one individual. They asked whether peace was worth the price. And for most, the answer was yes. Octavian understood this exhaustion better than any of his rivals. He had learned from the fate of Julius Caesar that overt kingship was unacceptable, even if the Republic itself was no longer functional. Instead of dismantling republican institutions, Octavian hollowed them out from within, preserving their appearance while ensuring that real authority flowed only through him. This subtlety was the foundation of his success. In 27 BCE, he staged a carefully orchestrated political settlement, formally returning power to the Senate while simultaneously accepting supreme authority over Rome's most important provinces and legions. The Senate, relieved and grateful, awarded him the title Augustus, a word heavy with religious and moral weight rather than explicit political dominance. Ancient writers were keenly aware of the illusion being created. Tacitus famously remarked that Augustus seduced the Roman world into obedience by offering stability in place of freedom. The Republic, in theory, still existed. Consuls were elected. The Senate debated. Magistracies continued. But none of these institutions could function independently of the emperor's will. Augustus controlled the army, the treasury, and the machinery of government. Opposition was not outlawed, it was rendered irrelevant. What made Augustus extraordinary was not merely his accumulation of power, but the way he reshaped Roman society to accept it. He understood that military victory alone could not sustain a new political order. Romans needed to believe that imperial rule restored traditional values rather than destroying them. To achieve this, Augustus launched a sweeping cultural and moral program that reached into every aspect of Roman life. He promoted marriage, family, and religious observance, framing his reign as a return to ancestral virtue after generations of chaos. Laws regulating adultery, inheritance, and family structure were passed not simply as moral measures, but as political ones, reinforcing the idea that Augustus was the guardian of Roman tradition rather than its betrayer. At the same time, Augustus restructured the Roman state with unprecedented efficiency. Provinces were reorganized to reduce corruption. Tax collection was standardized. A professional standing army was established, paid directly by the state rather than by individual generals, breaking the dangerous pattern of personal military loyalty that had destroyed the Republic. Veterans were settled on land provided by the state, reducing the risk of armed unrest. Rome itself was transformed through massive building projects that reshaped its skyline and symbolized the permanence of the new order. As Augustus famously claimed, he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Yet beneath this stability lay an uncomfortable reality. Rome had traded political participation for security. The Senate remained influential, but it no longer controlled events. Elections continued, but outcomes increasingly reflected imperial preference. Free speech existed, but criticism of the emperor carried invisible boundaries. This was not tyranny in the crude sense. It was something far more sophisticated, managed consensus. The success of Augustus set a precedent that would define the Roman Empire for centuries. His reign established the idea that one man could embody the state, serve as its moral compass, military commander, and ultimate authority, all while claiming to preserve republican tradition. It was a political contradiction, but a remarkably effective one. For over 40 years, Rome knew relative peace, economic growth, and administrative stability. The trauma of civil war faded from living memory. However, this success introduced a new and dangerous question. What happened after Augustus? The Republic had relied on competition and rotation of power. The empire depended on continuity of leadership. Augustus had no clear constitutional mechanism for succession because acknowledging such a mechanism would expose the monarchy he claimed not to hold. Instead, succession became a matter of personal arrangement, adoption, and family politics. This ambiguity nearly unraveled the system. Augustus outlived many potential heirs, and only in the final years of his life did he settle on Tiberius, a capable but deeply reluctant successor. When Augustus died in 14 CE, Rome faced a moment of profound uncertainty. For the first time, power passed peacefully from one ruler to another, but the process was fragile, dependent entirely on precedent rather than law. Tiberius inherited an empire that was stable but psychologically dependent on the figure of the emperor. He lacked Augustus's charisma and political instinct, and ancient sources paint him as suspicious, withdrawn, and increasingly authoritarian. While modern historians such as Mary Beard caution against taking these portrayals at face value, relying heavily on senatorial sources hostile to imperial power, there is no doubt that Tiberius struggled with the expectations placed upon him. The Senate, which had accepted subordination under Augustus, now attempted to assert itself, while simultaneously fearing imperial displeasure. This dynamic produced a climate of anxiety, flattery, and suspicion. Trials for treason became more common. Informers flourished. Political life grew tense. The system Augustus had built depended heavily on the personality of the emperor, revealing a structural weakness that would haunt Rome for centuries. Yet the empire endured. Despite flawed rulers and internal tension, the imperial system proved more resilient than the Republic had been in its final years. Provincial administration improved. Trade flourished across the Mediterranean. Roads, aqueducts, and cities bound the empire together. For ordinary inhabitants, especially outside Italy, imperial rule often brought greater stability and predictability than republican exploitation ever had. This contrast highlights a central paradox of Roman history. The republic collapsed under the strain of empire, but the empire survived by accepting that strain and reorganizing around it. Rome did not abandon expansion. It redefined governance. What it lost in political freedom, it gained in coherence. By the time Augustus's successors took power, Rome was no longer a city ruling an empire. It was an empire with a city at its heart. Identity shifted. Loyalty moved from institutions to the emperor himself. This transformation would shape Roman politics, culture, and conflict for generations. But this new system came with a price. Its stability depended on competent leadership, military loyalty, and economic balance. When any of these failed, crisis followed. And as Rome expanded further, maintaining that balance became increasingly difficult. In the next part, we will follow the early emperors of Rome, examining how imperial power functioned in practice, how succession crises and personality shaped the fate of the empire, and why the very system that brought peace also planted the seeds of future instability. With Augustus gone and the illusion of restored republican balance exposed, Rome entered a new and uncertain phase in which the empire's fate depended less on institutions than on the character and competence of individual rulers. The early imperial system functioned not because it was stable by design, but because it was held together by precedent, habit, and the lingering authority of Augustus himself. Once that personal authority vanished, the contradictions of imperial rule became impossible to ignore. Power was absolute in practice, but undefined in theory, and this ambiguity created a political environment where fear, suspicion, and improvisation replaced the confidence of the Augustan age. The reign of Tiberius illustrates this problem with brutal clarity. A capable general and administrator, Tiberius inherited an empire that was peaceful but psychologically dependent on a single figure at its center. He neither wanted nor enjoyed supreme power, yet he could not escape it. Ancient sources, especially Tacitus, portray his rule as one of growing paranoia and repression, a period marked by treason trials, political informers, and a Senate paralyzed by fear of imperial displeasure. While modern historians caution that these accounts reflect senatorial hostility toward emperors who diminished elite autonomy, the underlying tension is undeniable. The system demanded obedience while pretending to preserve freedom, and this contradiction poisoned political life. Under Tiberius, the Senate retained formal authority, but lost genuine influence. Senators competed not to govern effectively, but to interpret the emperor's unspoken wishes. Political initiative became dangerous. Silence became survival. This atmosphere did not emerge because Tiberius sought tyranny, but because the imperial structure rewarded caution and punished dissent. Rome had solved the problem of civil war, but it had not solved the problem of absolute power. The situation worsened dramatically after Tiberius withdrew from public life and retreated to Capri, leaving much of Rome's administration in the hands of the Praetorian prefect Sejanus. This development revealed another flaw in the imperial system. Power flowed to those closest to the emperor, not necessarily those most capable. When Sejanus overreached and was executed, the purge that followed deepened Rome's climate of fear. By the time Tiberius died in 37 CE, Rome was stable but brittle, governed through habit rather than trust. The accession of Caligula shattered any illusion that the imperial system could function independently of individual temperament. Initially welcomed as the son of the popular general Germanicus, Caligula's reign quickly descended into chaos. Ancient sources describe extravagant spending, erratic behavior, and deliberate humiliation of the Senate. While some modern scholars suggest that these accounts exaggerate or misinterpret Caligula's actions, what matters historically is not whether he was mad, but that the system had no defense against an emperor who rejected its unspoken rules. Caligula demonstrated that absolute power, when combined with instability, could destabilize the empire far more quickly than Republican factionalism ever had. His assassination in 41 CE by members of his own guard did not restore Republican government. Instead, it confirmed a new reality. The army, and especially the Praetorian Guard, had become the ultimate arbiter of power. The elevation of Claudius, an unlikely and underestimated figure, marked another adaptation rather than a solution. Claudius was scholarly, cautious, and administrative in temperament. His reign revealed that the imperial system could function effectively under a competent ruler, even one lacking traditional aristocratic prestige. Claudius expanded Roman citizenship, reformed provincial governance, and oversaw major infrastructure projects. Under his rule, the empire expanded into Britain, demonstrating that imperial ambition had not faded. Yet Claudius also highlighted a growing problem. The imperial household was becoming as important as the Senate itself. Freedmen, wives, and courtiers wielded enormous influence. Succession became entangled with family intrigue rather than public legitimacy. When Claudius died, likely poisoned, the empire passed to Nero, whose reign would become synonymous with excess, spectacle, and collapse. Nero's early years were stable, guided by experienced advisors, but as he consolidated power, he increasingly ruled through performance rather than governance. He cultivated popularity with the masses through games and public displays while alienating the elite. His artistic ambitions and disregard for senatorial norms reinforced the perception that the emperor was no longer first among equals, but a figure above society itself. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, whether or not Nero was responsible, symbolized a deeper breakdown between ruler and ruled. Ancient historians such as Suetonius and Tacitus present Nero as the embodiment of imperial decadence, but their hostility reflects a broader truth. The imperial system rewarded theatrical authority over institutional accountability. When that authority collapsed, so did loyalty. By the end of Nero's reign, revolts erupted across the provinces, and the army withdrew its support. In 68 CE, Nero committed suicide, and with him died the Julio-Claudian dynasty. What followed was the Year of the Four Emperors, a rapid succession of rulers backed by competing armies. Rome once again descended into civil war, revealing that the empire's stability rested on military allegiance rather than constitutional order. Yet even this crisis did not destroy the imperial system. Instead, it confirmed its necessity. Romans no longer debated whether emperors should rule. They debated which emperor could restore order. The rise of Vespasian marked a critical recalibration. Coming from outside the traditional aristocracy, Vespasian restored discipline, repaired finances, and reinforced the idea that imperial authority derived from effectiveness rather than lineage. His reign, and that of his successors, demonstrated that the empire could survive dynastic collapse as long as the system adapted. By the end of the 1st century CE, Rome had learned a hard lesson. The Republic was gone forever, but the empire was not a finished structure. It was an evolving response to scale, diversity, and power. Stability depended not on ideals, but on management. Legitimacy flowed not from law, but from results. In the next part, we will explore how Rome entered its greatest period of stability under the so-called good emperors, why this era represented the peak of Roman power, and how the seeds of long-term decline were already present even at the empire's height. By the late 1st century CE, Rome had survived something extraordinary. In less than 100 years, it had transformed from a republic defined by competition and shared power into an empire ruled by a single figure, endured multiple succession crises, descended into civil war, and emerged intact. This survival was not the result of strong laws or constitutional clarity, but of pragmatic adaptation. Rome did not solve the problem of power, it learned to manage it. That management reached its most effective form during the period later remembered as the age of the so-called Five Good Emperors, a time when imperial authority aligned, briefly, with competence, restraint, and administrative vision. The reign of Nerva marked a turning point, not because of its length, but because of the precedent it set. Elderly and politically cautious, Nerva recognized that the survival of the empire depended on resolving the greatest weakness of imperial rule: succession. Rather than relying on bloodline alone, he adopted a capable adult successor, establishing a principle that would stabilize Rome for nearly a century. This act, described approvingly by later historians such as Cassius Dio, signaled a shift away from dynastic accident toward deliberate continuity. Under Trajan, Rome reached the greatest territorial extent in its history. Trajan was a soldier emperor in the truest sense, admired by both the army and the Senate for his discipline, generosity, and sense of duty. His campaigns in Dacia and the eastern provinces expanded Rome's borders while flooding the imperial treasury with wealth. Yet Trajan's significance lies not only in conquest, but in governance. He maintained open communication with the Senate, invested heavily in infrastructure, and oversaw welfare programs that supported poor children across Italy. As noted by modern historian Adrian Goldsworthy, Trajan represented the ideal balance between authority and accountability that the imperial system rarely achieved. This period of expansion, however, also revealed the limits of Roman power. Holding distant territories required enormous resources and constant military presence. Trajan's successor, Hadrian, recognized this reality and made a decision that would define his reign and Rome's future. Hadrian abandoned further expansion and focused instead on consolidation. He traveled extensively throughout the empire, inspecting defenses, reforming administration, and reinforcing boundaries. His construction of Hadrian's Wall in Britain symbolized a profound shift in Roman strategy. Rome would no longer grow indefinitely. It would defend what it had. Hadrian's reign exposed a truth that Roman elites often resisted. Empire required restraint as much as ambition. Expansion brought prestige, but stability required limits. His policies strengthened the empire internally, standardizing legal systems, improving provincial governance, and reducing reliance on brute force. Yet these same policies also signaled that Rome had reached a plateau. The empire was vast, but not infinite. The succession continued smoothly under Antoninus Pius, whose reign was marked by peace and administrative efficiency. Rarely leaving Italy, Antoninus governed through correspondence and delegation, maintaining stability across a vast and diverse empire. Ancient sources emphasize the calm of his rule, but modern historians note that this calm depended heavily on the groundwork laid by his predecessors. Antoninus did not face major wars, not because threats vanished, but because Rome's systems still functioned effectively. The final figure in this sequence, Marcus Aurelius, embodied the philosophical ideal of the ruler as servant of the state. A Stoic thinker and reluctant emperor, Marcus Aurelius ruled during one of the most challenging periods Rome had faced since the civil wars. Plague ravaged the population, invasions threatened the northern frontiers, economic pressure mounted. Despite these challenges, Marcus maintained administrative discipline and moral seriousness, famously reflecting on the burden of power in his private writings. Yet even during this celebrated age, the seeds of long-term decline were present. Rome's prosperity relied on continuous extraction of resources from provinces. Its economy depended heavily on slavery and conquest. Its political stability hinged on the competence of individual emperors rather than resilient institutions. The adoption system that had worked so well during this period was never guaranteed to continue. When Marcus Aurelius died and power passed to his biological son, Commodus, the limits of imperial idealism became clear. Commodus lacked his father's discipline and sense of responsibility. His reign marked a return to personal rule defined by spectacle, favoritism, and neglect of governance. The system that had functioned under capable rulers offered little resistance to incompetence. Roman historians such as Cassius Dio viewed Commodus's reign as the end of an era, noting that Rome descended from a kingdom of gold into one of iron and rust. While this assessment reflects elite disappointment, it captures a real transition. The empire had grown dependent on exceptional leadership, and exceptional leadership could not be guaranteed. The death of Commodus ushered in another period of instability, revealing a deeper structural problem. Rome had perfected the art of ruling an empire, but it had never solved the problem of sustaining power across generations without crisis. Stability was achieved not through systems, but through individuals, and individuals were fallible. This contradiction defines the Roman Empire at its height. It was administratively sophisticated, militarily dominant, and culturally influential. It provided peace and prosperity to millions. Yet it remained vulnerable to succession disputes, economic strain, and external pressure. The very size that made Rome powerful also made it fragile. As the 2nd century drew to a close, the illusion of permanent stability began to fade. The empire was still vast, still wealthy, still formidable, but it had lost the balance that had sustained it. The era of expansion and confident consolidation was ending, and a more turbulent age lay ahead. In the next part, we will follow Rome into the 3rd century, a period of relentless crisis marked by invasion, economic collapse, political fragmentation, and the near disintegration of imperial authority, revealing how close Rome came to complete collapse long before its final fall. As the 2nd century came to an end, the Roman Empire stood at what appeared to be the height of its power, yet beneath that surface, strength, lay structural weaknesses that had been accumulating for generations. The death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE did not merely mark the end of a reign, it marked the end of an era in which imperial stability had depended on competence, restraint, and continuity, by adoption rather than inheritance. When power passed to Commodus, the empire entered a phase where the contradictions of imperial rule could no longer be managed quietly, and the consequences unfolded with stunning speed. Commodus inherited an empire strained by war, disease, and economic pressure, but instead of addressing these challenges, he withdrew from governance and transformed the imperial role into a spectacle. Ancient sources, such as Cassius Dio, describe an emperor obsessed with personal glory, public games, and displays of power rather than administration. While modern historians rightly note that senatorial authors exaggerated his excesses, the broader picture is clear. Effective governance declined, decision-making fragmented, and loyalty shifted away from institutions toward personal networks and military factions. The assassination of Commodus in 192 CE did not restore order. It exposed how fragile imperial authority had become. What followed was a rapid descent into chaos. The year after Commodus's death saw multiple emperors rise and fall, each backed by different military forces, revealing a reality that could no longer be ignored. The Roman emperor was no longer the guardian of the state. He was the prize in a contest between armies. The Senate, long reduced to ceremonial relevance, could neither prevent nor control these struggles. Power now flowed from military support alone, and that support was increasingly transactional. The Severan dynasty emerged from this instability not by restoring earlier ideals, but by embracing a harsher truth. Under Septimius Severus, the empire was held together through military dominance and financial reward. Severus famously advised his sons to enrich the soldiers and ignore everyone else, a statement that ancient historians preserved not as rhetoric, but as policy. The army expanded, soldiers' pay increased, and military loyalty became the foundation of imperial survival. This strategy brought short-term stability, but at immense cost. Funding the military required unprecedented taxation and currency debasement. Silver content in Roman coinage declined sharply, triggering inflation and undermining trust in the economy. Provinces bore the burden, while urban centers struggled to maintain infrastructure and public services. As Herodian records, resentment grew as the empire's wealth flowed increasingly toward sustaining armies rather than communities. At the same time, the frontiers of the empire grew more volatile. Germanic confederations along the Rhine and Danube became larger and more organized, no longer isolated tribal threats, but persistent military forces capable of exploiting Roman weakness. In the east, the rise of the Sasanian Persian Empire replaced Rome's old Parthian rival with a centralized, aggressive power that challenged Roman dominance directly. The empire was no longer facing scattered threats. It was facing rivals of equal ambition. The assassination of Emperor Alexander Severus in 235 CE triggered what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of nearly 50 years in which the Roman world teetered on the brink of total collapse. Emperors rose and fell at astonishing speed, many ruling for months or even weeks before being killed by their own troops. Loyalty evaporated. Legitimacy meant nothing without force. Civil war became constant. During this period, the empire fractured. Breakaway states emerged in Gaul and the eastern provinces, ruled by local strongmen who provided stability where Rome could not. Trade networks collapsed, cities declined, coinage became nearly worthless. Plague and famine followed warfare, compounding human suffering. Archaeological evidence from this era reveals abandoned towns, reduced construction, and shrinking populations, clear indicators of systemic breakdown. Yet even at its lowest point, Rome did not disappear. The empire survived because its administrative habits, legal culture, and logistical systems, though strained, did not vanish entirely. Local officials continued to collect taxes. Armies still marched. Roads and fortifications, though neglected, remained functional. The Roman world bent, but it did not break. Recovery came not through reform, but through transformation. In the late 3rd century, a series of soldier emperors began to impose order through ruthless efficiency. Among them, Aurelian stands out as a figure who nearly saved the empire by force alone. Aurelian defeated breakaway regimes, restored territorial unity, and reinforced Rome's defenses, including the construction of massive new walls around the city itself, a symbolic admission that even Rome was no longer secure. Aurelian's assassination underscored the persistent danger of militarized politics, but his achievements demonstrated that survival was still possible. The empire's salvation would come not from restoring old republican illusions or Augustan compromise, but from accepting a new reality. Rome could no longer be governed as a city-state ruling an empire. It had to become something else entirely. By the end of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire had been reshaped by crisis. Power was centralized, militarized, and increasingly authoritarian. The illusion of shared governance was gone. In its place stood a state focused on survival above all else. This transformation marked the end of the classical Roman world and the beginning of a late imperial system that would endure, in altered form, for centuries. In the next part, we will examine how emperors like Diocletian and Constantine rebuilt the Roman state, radically redefining power, religion, and identity, and laying the foundations for a new kind of empire that would outlast the ancient world itself. By the end of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire had reached a breaking point that forced a fundamental reimagining of what Rome was and how it could survive. The crises of invasion, inflation, civil war, and fragmentation had not merely exposed weaknesses in imperial governance, they had rendered the old model of rule obsolete. The idea that one emperor, ruling from Rome, balancing senatorial traditions with personal authority, could manage an empire of such size and volatility was no longer credible. Survival now demanded radical restructuring, and that restructuring would come from one of the most consequential figures in Roman history, Diocletian. Diocletian did not attempt to restore the empire that had existed under Augustus or Trajan. He accepted, with clear-eyed realism, that the Roman world had changed permanently. External threats were constant rather than episodic. Armies needed to respond rapidly across vast distances. Provincial populations required predictable taxation and protection. Most importantly, imperial authority had to be visible everywhere at once, not embodied in a single distant figure. Diocletian's solution was revolutionary. He divided imperial power, creating a system known as the Tetrarchy, in which 4 emperors ruled simultaneously, each responsible for a different region of the empire. This was not a sharing of power in the republican sense, but a multiplication of authority designed to ensure continuity. 2 senior emperors, the Augusti, were supported by 2 junior emperors, the Caesars, establishing a planned succession that aimed to prevent the violent power struggles that had plagued the 3rd century. Diocletian himself ruled from the eastern provinces, while his colleagues governed the west, bringing imperial presence closer to threatened frontiers. For the first time, Rome was no longer the functional center of the empire. Power had become mobile. This administrative reorganization was matched by sweeping economic and social reforms. Diocletian recognized that the empire's financial collapse threatened its very existence. He restructured taxation to be assessed more systematically across provinces, tying land and labor directly to state obligations. These reforms stabilized revenue but came at a social cost. Many occupations became hereditary. Farmers were bound to their land. Artisans were locked into their trades. The late Roman state traded flexibility for control, prioritizing survival over freedom. Currency reform followed, attempting to restore confidence after decades of debasement. While not entirely successful, these measures reflected a broader shift in imperial mentality. The empire was no longer a partnership between elite and populace. It was a command structure designed to extract resources efficiently to support defense and administration. The Roman citizen, once a political participant, was now primarily a taxpayer. Diocletian also transformed the nature of imperial authority itself. Earlier emperors had presented themselves as first among equals, maintaining a facade of republican continuity. Diocletian abandoned this pretense entirely. He adopted an overtly autocratic style, emphasizing ritual, hierarchy, and divine sanction. The emperor became a distant, almost sacred figure, approached through layers of ceremony and bureaucracy. This shift, described by later historians as the transition from the principate to the dominate, marked a psychological break with Rome's past. Yet Diocletian's reforms, for all their ambition, could not outlive his personal authority. When he abdicated voluntarily in 305 CE, the tetrarchic system collapsed under the weight of rivalry and ambition. Succession disputes erupted almost immediately, revealing that even carefully planned structures could not restrain human competition. Civil war returned, though now within a more rigid and militarized state. Out of this turmoil emerged another figure whose impact would rival that of Augustus, Constantine the Great. Constantine's rise to power was marked by brutal conflict, but his legacy would redefine the Roman Empire in ways no previous ruler had imagined. Where Diocletian had reorganized power, Constantine would redefine identity. Constantine's most consequential act was his embrace of Christianity, a religion that had grown steadily despite periodic persecution. According to Christian tradition recorded by writers such as Eusebius of Caesarea, Constantine experienced a divine vision before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, leading him to adopt the Christian symbol and win decisive victory. Whether literal or symbolic, the result was unmistakable. Christianity moved from the margins of Roman society to the center of imperial power. The legalization and later patronage of Christianity transformed the empire's cultural foundation. Temples gave way to churches, bishops gained influence, imperial authority fused with religious legitimacy in new ways. Constantine did not simply tolerate Christianity. He used it as a unifying force in an empire fractured by decades of crisis. The emperor now ruled not only by military strength, but by divine favor. Constantine also made a decision that would shape the future of Europe and the Mediterranean for 1,000 years. He founded a new imperial capital at Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople. Strategically positioned between Europe and Asia, fortified and wealthy, the city symbolized the shift of power eastward. Rome remained important as a symbol, but it was no longer indispensable. Under Constantine, the Roman Empire was reborn as something fundamentally different from the world Augustus had created. It was more centralized, more bureaucratic, more openly autocratic, and increasingly Christian. These changes stabilized the empire in the short term and allowed it to survive pressures that would have destroyed earlier forms of Roman rule. But this transformation came with long-term consequences. The empire's unity became more fragile. Cultural differences between East and West deepened. Military and economic priorities shifted. The Roman world was no longer one civilization with many provinces, but a collection of regions held together by force, faith, and administration. As Constantine's successors struggled to manage this new empire, the question of sustainability returned once more. Had Rome reinvented itself successfully, or merely postponed another collapse? In the next part, we will follow the Roman Empire into its final centuries in the West, examining how external invasion, internal division, and economic strain brought an end to imperial rule in Rome itself, even as Roman civilization continued elsewhere. By the middle of the 4th century, the Roman Empire had survived what should have destroyed it. It had endured decades of civil war, economic collapse, plague, and near fragmentation, yet it emerged reorganized, centralized, and ideologically transformed. From a distance, the empire appeared stable once more, but this stability masked a growing imbalance between its eastern and western halves that would define the final centuries of Roman rule. The reforms of Diocletian and Constantine saved the empire, but they also revealed a hard truth. Rome could no longer function as a single uniform system. The conditions that sustained the eastern provinces differed fundamentally from those in the west, and the consequences of that divergence would be profound. The Eastern Empire was wealthier, more urbanized, and more deeply integrated into long-distance trade networks that stretched into Asia and Africa. Cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and Constantinople were economic engines capable of sustaining large populations and complex administration. Tax revenues flowed more reliably. Infrastructure remained functional. Military supply lines were shorter and easier to defend. By contrast, the Western Empire relied heavily on agriculture, suffered from lower population density, and depended on long exposed frontiers along the Rhine and Danube. Its cities were smaller, its tax base weaker, and its ability to respond to crisis more limited. This imbalance forced imperial policy to prioritize survival over uniformity. Resources increasingly flowed eastward, not because emperors favored the region ideologically, but because it offered the greatest return on investment. The West, meanwhile, faced mounting pressure from migrating and invading groups moving across Europe, pushed in part by climate shifts and population movements far beyond Rome's borders. These groups were not a single force, but a series of confederations: Goths, Vandals, Franks, Alemanni, each responding to local conditions, yet collectively placing unprecedented strain on Roman defenses. Rome's response to these pressures marked another fundamental shift in imperial strategy. Rather than attempting to exclude these groups entirely, Roman authorities increasingly sought to manage them. Treaties were signed. Entire peoples were settled within imperial borders as foederati, obligated to provide military service in exchange for land. In theory, this policy extended Rome's traditional approach of incorporation. In practice, it introduced new risks. Loyalty became conditional, military cohesion weakened, authority fragmented. The Gothic War of the late 4th century exposed these vulnerabilities with devastating clarity. When Gothic refugees fleeing pressure from the Huns were mistreated by Roman officials, rebellion followed. In 378 CE, the Roman army suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Adrianople, where Emperor Valens was killed and a large portion of the Eastern Field Army destroyed. Ancient sources, such as Ammianus Marcellinus, recognized this moment as a turning point. For the first time in centuries, a Roman emperor had fallen in battle against a barbarian force, and the myth of Roman invincibility was shattered. Although the Eastern Empire recovered, the psychological impact was lasting. Rome could no longer rely on overwhelming military superiority. Negotiation, settlement, and accommodation became necessary tools of survival. These strategies worked unevenly, preserving stability in the east while deepening fragmentation in the west. The final division of the empire after the death of Theodosius I in 395 CE formalized what had already become reality. The empire was split permanently between eastern and western courts, each ruled independently. While this division simplified administration, it also meant that the West would face its challenges with fewer resources and less support. The Western Empire now entered a prolonged period of contraction rather than sudden collapse. Its decline was not marked by a single catastrophic event, but by a steady erosion of authority. Provinces were lost gradually. Tax systems broke down. Local elites withdrew from public life, focusing on private estates rather than imperial service. Urban centers shrank or were abandoned altogether. The machinery of government continued to operate, but with diminishing reach. In 410 CE, the unthinkable occurred when Rome itself was sacked by Gothic forces under Alaric. Though the city was no longer the political capital, its symbolic weight was immense. For centuries, Rome had stood as the eternal city, immune to foreign conquest. Its sack sent shockwaves across the Mediterranean world. As Jerome famously wrote, "The light of the world was extinguished." Yet even this event did not end Roman rule in the West. It revealed, instead, how much Rome's identity had shifted. The empire could survive without Rome, but the West could not survive without imperial cohesion. Over the following decades, the Western Empire fragmented further. Provinces such as Britain were effectively abandoned. Gaul and Spain fell under the control of successor kingdoms. North Africa, once a vital source of grain and revenue, was lost to the Vandals. Each loss weakened the system further, reducing the resources available to defend what remained. By the mid-5th century, the Western Emperor was no longer a commanding figure, but a dependent one, propped up by powerful generals and fragile alliances. The office retained its title, but little substance. When the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 CE, the event passed with remarkably little immediate disruption. There was no dramatic collapse, no final battle that ended Rome. Imperial administration had already ceased to function in meaningful ways. What ended in the West was not Roman civilization, but Roman imperial authority. Law, language, culture, and identity endured long after the fall of the throne. Roman systems lived on in the Eastern Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, and in the emerging kingdoms of Western Europe, which adapted Roman structures to new realities. This distinction is crucial. Rome did not fall because it failed. It transformed because the conditions that sustained its Western Empire no longer existed. The East survived because it adapted differently, leveraging urbanization, wealth, and strategic geography to maintain continuity. As we move into the final phase of this story, the question becomes less about why Rome fell and more about what Rome became. How did a city-state evolve into an empire, fracture into halves, and leave a legacy that still shapes law, politics, religion, and identity today? In the next part, we will examine the survival of Rome in the East and the enduring legacy of Roman civilization long after imperial power vanished in the West. When imperial authority vanished in the West, Rome did not disappear from history. Instead, it shifted its center of gravity eastward, where the empire continued to exist in a form that was unmistakably Roman, yet profoundly transformed. The Eastern Roman Empire, which modern historians call the Byzantine Empire, did not see itself as a successor state or a rebirth. It considered itself Rome itself, governed by Roman law, ruled by Roman emperors, and sustained by Roman institutions, even as language, religion, and culture evolved. This continuity explains why the fall of the Western Empire in 476 CE did not feel like an ending to contemporaries in Constantinople. From their perspective, Rome endured. The Eastern Empire's survival was not accidental. It rested on structural advantages that the West lacked. Constantinople controlled key trade routes linking Europe and Asia, generating wealth through commerce rather than conquest alone. Its fortified position made it extraordinarily difficult to capture, and its proximity to prosperous provinces in Asia Minor and Egypt ensured a reliable tax base. Unlike the West, where aristocrats retreated into private estates, Eastern elites remained deeply invested in imperial administration, reinforcing state authority rather than undermining it. Religion played a central role in this transformation. Christianity, now firmly embedded within imperial identity, provided a unifying ideology that transcended ethnic and regional divisions. The emperor was no longer merely a political ruler, but a divinely sanctioned protector of the faith. This fusion of state and religion strengthened loyalty while reshaping Roman identity. Greek gradually replaced Latin as the primary language of administration, not because Rome had abandoned its past, but because it adapted to the realities of its population. Roman law remained the backbone of governance, codified most famously under Justinian I, whose legal reforms preserved Roman jurisprudence for future civilizations. Justinian's reign in the 6th century marked the last great attempt to restore Roman unity. Through ambitious military campaigns, his generals reconquered North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain, briefly re-establishing imperial authority in the West. These efforts demonstrated that Rome still possessed the capacity for expansion, but they also revealed the limits of imperial ambition in a changed world. The wars drained resources, devastated Italy, and left the empire overstretched. When new threats emerged from the east and north, reconquered territories proved impossible to hold. Despite these challenges, the Eastern Empire endured for nearly 1,000 years after the fall of Rome in the West. It survived through adaptation rather than nostalgia, maintaining Roman identity while embracing cultural change. Its emperors ruled through bureaucracy, diplomacy, and carefully managed military force. Where the Western Empire fractured into successor kingdoms, the Eastern Empire institutionalized continuity. Meanwhile, in the West, Roman civilization did not vanish. It fragmented and recombined. Germanic rulers adopted Roman law, administrative practices, and titles to legitimize their authority. The Church preserved Latin literacy, legal concepts, and historical memory. Cities shrank, but Roman roads, boundaries, and institutions shaped medieval Europe in subtle but lasting ways. Rome ceased to rule politically, but it continued to rule culturally. This dual legacy complicates the idea of Rome's fall. The empire collapsed in the West, not because its civilization failed, but because imperial authority could no longer be sustained under Western conditions. The East survived because it adapted faster and more thoroughly. Rome's history, therefore, is not a story of rise and fall, but of transformation across centuries. The Roman experience reveals a central truth about power. Longevity depends less on strength than on flexibility. Rome endured not because it resisted change, but because it embraced it unevenly, sometimes too late, sometimes just in time. Its failures were not the result of ignorance or decadence alone, but of structural challenges inherent to governing vast, diverse populations across unstable environments. As this story draws closer to its conclusion, the focus shifts from chronology to meaning. Why does Rome still matter? Why does its story continue to captivate centuries after its political authority vanished? The answer lies in scale and influence. Rome was not merely an empire, it was a framework for organizing society, law, religion, and identity on a scale previously unimaginable. Rome demonstrated both the potential and the limits of centralized power. It showed how institutions could bind millions together under shared rules and how those same institutions could fracture under pressure. It revealed how success creates new vulnerabilities, how expansion reshapes identity, and how adaptation determines survival. The Roman Empire did not collapse in a single moment, nor did it vanish completely. It changed form repeatedly, shedding structures that no longer worked and reinforcing those that did. Its legacy persisted not because it was perfect, but because it was influential enough to be inherited. In the final parts of this documentary, we will step back from events and examine Rome's enduring impact on law, governance, warfare, religion, and the modern world. We will explore what Rome teaches us about power, collapse, and continuity, and why its story remains one of the most important narratives in human history. By the time the Roman Empire ceased to exist as a unified political power, it had already embedded itself so deeply into the structures of Europe, North Africa, and the Near East that its disappearance from maps did not equate to its disappearance from life. Rome's most enduring legacy was not its legions or emperors, but its systems. Law, administration, infrastructure, and ideas about authority outlived the empire itself, shaping societies that would never again call themselves Roman, yet could not escape Rome's influence. Roman law stands as one of the most powerful examples of this continuity. From the 12 tables of the early Republic to the monumental legal compilations under Justinian I, Roman legal thought emphasized clarity, precedent, and universality. These principles survived the fall of imperial authority in the West and were preserved by church institutions and later rediscovered in medieval Europe, forming the foundation of modern civil law systems. The idea that law should be written, standardized, and applied consistently was a Roman innovation whose impact remains visible in legal codes across the world today. Equally influential was Rome's conception of governance. The empire demonstrated that large, diverse populations could be administered through layered bureaucracy rather than constant force alone. Provincial administration, tax collection, census taking, and record keeping were refined to levels unmatched in the ancient world. Even as central authority weakened in the West, local Roman administrative practices continued under new rulers because they worked. Germanic kings did not abolish Roman systems, they adopted them, relying on Roman-trained officials to govern populations that still lived according to Roman custom. The Roman military legacy followed a similar pattern. Although the legions themselves eventually disappeared, Roman ideas about discipline, organization, and logistics shaped warfare long after imperial collapse. Roads built to move troops became trade routes. Fortifications became medieval strongholds. Military hierarchy and command structures influenced successor kingdoms, embedding Roman strategic thinking into European warfare for centuries. Religion, perhaps more than any other force, carried Rome forward into the future. Christianity, once a persecuted sect within the empire, became the primary vehicle through which Roman culture and memory survived. Church organization mirrored imperial administration. Bishops inherited roles once held by governors. Latin became the language of scholarship and worship in the West, preserving Roman intellectual traditions. Even as political Rome fell, ecclesiastical Rome endured. This continuity complicates the narrative of decline. Rome did not collapse into darkness. It transitioned into new forms of authority that carried forward Roman assumptions about order, legitimacy, and law. The medieval world was not built on Rome's ashes alone, but on its foundations. Yet Rome's legacy also includes cautionary lessons. Its history reveals the dangers of overextension, the fragility of systems dependent on exceptional leadership, and the cost of inequality within complex societies. Ancient historians, such as Tacitus, warned that empires rot from within as much as they are attacked from without, a theme echoed by modern scholars like Peter Heather and Kyle Harper, who emphasize environmental stress, economic imbalance, and institutional rigidity as key factors in Rome's transformation. Rome's story challenges the idea that collapse is sudden or simple. It unfolded across centuries, marked by adaptation as much as failure. The empire's ability to reinvent itself repeatedly delayed collapse and reshaped its outcome. Where the West fragmented, the East persisted. Where political power faded, cultural influence endured. This long view forces a reassessment of success and failure in history. Rome's endurance for over a millennium was not the result of flawless design, but of continual reinvention. Its eventual political fragmentation does not negate its achievements. Instead, it highlights the limits of any system faced with changing environments, populations, and technologies. Perhaps Rome's most profound contribution lies in the questions it leaves behind. How large can a society grow before its systems strain beyond repair? How much inequality can be sustained before cohesion fails? How do institutions adapt without losing legitimacy? These questions remain unresolved because they are not uniquely Roman. They are human. Rome's history endures because it mirrors our own struggles with power, identity, and change. Its rise shows the potential of cooperation and organization. Its transformation reveals the cost of success. Its survival through adaptation offers a lesson that remains relevant in every age. As we move toward the final sections of this documentary, the story of Rome becomes less about emperors and battles and more about legacy. What does it mean for a civilization to endure beyond its political life? How do ideas outlast institutions? And why does Rome, more than any other ancient society, continue to shape the modern world? In the next part, we will draw these threads together, examining Rome not just as a historical empire, but as a lasting framework for understanding power, continuity, and the long arc of human civilization. When the story of Rome is viewed not as a sequence of emperors or battles, but as a continuous experiment in human organization, its true significance becomes clearer. Rome was not exceptional because it never failed, but because it failed repeatedly and yet continued to adapt. Few societies have tested so many political forms over such a long span of time, moving from monarchy to republic, from republic to empire, from pagan state to Christian empire, and finally into fragmented successor worlds that still carried Roman DNA. Each transformation reflected an attempt to solve problems created by the previous solution. At its core, Rome grappled with a problem that still defines large societies today: how to balance scale with cohesion. Early Rome succeeded because its political culture allowed conflict to exist without destroying the system. Competition was regulated, ambition constrained, and power shared, unevenly but effectively. As Rome expanded, those mechanisms broke down. The Republic could conquer territory, but it could not govern an empire without changing its nature. The empire solved that problem through centralization, but at the cost of political participation and flexibility. Each stage addressed immediate pressures while creating new vulnerabilities. Roman history therefore resists simple moral conclusions. It is tempting to frame the Republic as virtuous and the empire as corrupt, or to describe late Rome as decadent and early Rome as disciplined. Ancient authors like Sallust encouraged such contrasts, but modern scholarship paints a more complex picture. Rome did not decay because its people lost virtue. It transformed because conditions changed faster than institutions could evolve. The Roman state was remarkably innovative in administrative terms. Census-taking, taxation, infrastructure planning, and legal standardization allowed Rome to govern populations larger than any previous civilization had attempted. These systems worked because they were impersonal. Loyalty shifted from personal relationships to abstract authority. That shift enabled scale, but it also reduced resilience. When trust in the system eroded, there were fewer social bonds to compensate. One of Rome's enduring lessons is that power becomes fragile when it depends too heavily on performance. Imperial legitimacy rested on the emperor's ability to deliver security, prosperity, and order. When emperors succeeded, the system appeared stable. When they failed, the system unraveled quickly. This dependency on individual competence explains both Rome's long periods of stability and its sudden crises. Religion played a critical role in managing this fragility. Pagan Rome relied on ritual and tradition to reinforce continuity, but these systems struggled to adapt to imperial scale. Christianity provided a more flexible framework, offering universal identity, moral coherence, and institutional continuity that transcended political borders. The Church did not replace the Roman state, but it absorbed many of its functions, ensuring that Roman concepts of authority and law survived long after imperial administration faded in the West. Rome's cultural legacy also challenges the idea that history moves forward by replacement. Roman influence persisted not because later societies copied Rome deliberately, but because Roman systems were embedded in daily life. Roads determined trade, Laws shaped property. Language structured thought. Even when people rejected Roman rule, they often retained Roman tools because those tools worked. This continuity complicates the notion of collapse. Rome did not fall off a cliff. It thinned, fragmented, and reconfigured. Power became local rather than imperial. Authority shifted from emperors to kings, bishops, and warlords. Yet Roman identity remained a reference point for legitimacy. To claim Roman inheritance was to claim order itself. Modern fascination with Rome often reflects modern anxieties. Questions about overextension, inequality, environmental stress, and institutional rigidity feel familiar because they are perennial. Rome's story endures not because it offers simple warnings, but because it shows how complex systems behave under pressure. Sometimes they reform, sometimes they fracture, often they do both at once. Perhaps the most important insight Rome offers is humility. No system, however advanced, is immune to change. Longevity does not guarantee permanence. Strength does not eliminate vulnerability. Rome survived longer than any of its contemporaries not because it avoided crisis, but because it responded to crisis with experimentation rather than denial. This is why Rome's end is so difficult to define. If the fall of the Western Empire marks failure, then the survival of Roman law, religion, and identity marks success. If imperial authority disappeared, Roman civilization endured. Rome ceased to exist as a state, but not as a framework. As we approach the final parts of this documentary, the narrative shifts from history to reflection. Rome's greatest contribution may not lie in what it built, but in what it revealed about human societies. That power must adapt to scale, that institutions must evolve or fracture, and that continuity often survives through transformation rather than preservation. In the final section, we will bring the entire story together, asking what Rome ultimately teaches us about civilization itself, and why its long arc, from village to empire to legacy, remains one of the most instructive stories humanity has ever told. When Rome is viewed across its full span, from a fragile settlement on the Tiber to a civilization whose influence outlived its political authority, the most striking realization is that Rome was never a static entity. It was a process. It evolved not according to a master plan, but through constant negotiation between ambition and limitation. Each generation inherited structures built to solve earlier problems and then reshaped them to confront new realities. In this sense, Rome's history is not exceptional because it avoided collapse, but because it repeatedly postponed it through reinvention. Rome's earliest success lay in its ability to integrate rather than exclude. Citizenship, once tightly guarded, expanded gradually to encompass allies, then former enemies, and eventually entire provinces. This inclusiveness was not altruistic, it was strategic. By tying conquered peoples to Roman law and identity, Rome transformed potential rivals into stakeholders. Few ancient states pursued integration on this scale, and fewer still sustained it for centuries. Yet even this strength carried consequences. Expansion diluted the intimacy of political participation, weakening the bonds that had once defined republican life. The transition from republic to empire illustrates how systems adapt when scale overwhelms tradition. The republic collapsed not because Romans abandoned its ideals, but because those ideals could no longer function within an imperial context. The empire succeeded not because it was morally superior, but because it acknowledged the need for centralized authority. Rome repeatedly chose practicality over purity, even when doing so contradicted its own myths about freedom and shared power. This pragmatism explains Rome's longevity. It accepted compromises that other societies rejected. It tolerated contradiction. It allowed old institutions to survive as symbols long after their power had faded, providing continuity even as reality shifted. The Senate, the magistracies, and republican language persisted not because they governed effectively, but because they stabilized identity. Rome understood that legitimacy often mattered more than coherence. Yet Rome also reveals the cost of compromise. As imperial power concentrated, social inequality deepened, economic extraction intensified, military necessity overrode civic participation. Over time, the empire relied more on coercion than consent, especially in the West, where resources dwindled and threats multiplied. These pressures did not destroy Rome overnight, but they narrowed its options, making each crisis harder to absorb. Environmental stress, once a background condition, became a decisive factor. Modern scholarship, particularly the work of Kyle Harper, has highlighted how climate fluctuation, pandemic disease, and ecological limits intersected with political instability. Rome did not fall solely because of barbarian invasion or internal decay. It faced a convergence of pressures that tested even its formidable systems. The empire's survival in the East reflects not superiority of character, but difference in geography, economy, and adaptability. Rome's fragmentation in the West was therefore not an anomaly, but a predictable outcome of uneven resilience. Where urbanization, trade, and administrative density persisted, Roman structures endured. Where they did not, authority localized. The Western Empire did not collapse into chaos. It reorganized into smaller political units better suited to local conditions. Roman civilization survived by decentralizing itself. This reframes Rome's end not as tragedy, but as transition. The idea of Rome, law, order, legitimacy, outlived the empire because it had already detached itself from any single political form. Rome had become an abstraction, a reference point, a model. Medieval kings invoked Rome to justify authority. Church leaders preserved Roman law and language. Renaissance thinkers rediscovered Roman texts to imagine new futures. Rome became a lens through which later societies understood themselves. The persistence of Roman influence raises an important question. Why Rome above all other ancient civilizations? The answer lies in scale and system. Rome did not merely conquer territory, it standardized experience. Roads, laws, calendars, currencies, and institutions created a shared framework across continents. This standardization made Roman practices transferable long after the empire's dissolution. Other civilizations produced brilliance. Rome produced infrastructure for continuity. Yet Rome's legacy also endures because it embodies contradiction. It represents both freedom and domination, law and violence, integration and exclusion. It shows how power can unify and fracture simultaneously. These tensions make Rome endlessly interpretable. Every era finds its own reflection in Roman history. Modern societies return to Rome not out of nostalgia, but because Rome confronts us with uncomfortable truths. No political system is permanent. No solution scales indefinitely. Institutions must evolve faster than the problems they address. When they do not, fragmentation follows. Rome teaches us that collapse is rarely the result of a single failure, but of cumulative strain and delayed adaptation. At the same time, Rome offers reassurance. Even when systems fail, culture, knowledge, and identity persist. Civilizations do not vanish, they transform. The Roman world did not end in 476 CE. It diffused into Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, shaping languages, borders, and beliefs that remain with us today. As we approach the final part of this documentary, Rome stands not as a warning carved in stone, but as a record of human endurance. Its long history reminds us that survival depends not on perfection, but on flexibility. Rome did not last because it avoided crisis. It lasted because it learned, repeatedly, how to live with it. In the concluding section, we will step back fully from chronology and ask what Rome ultimately teaches us about civilization itself, about power, identity, collapse, and continuity, and why its story continues to matter in a world that still struggles with the same fundamental challenges. When the full history of Rome is finally viewed as a single continuum rather than a series of isolated eras, what emerges is not the story of a city that rose and fell, but of a civilization that repeatedly redefined what survival meant. Rome endured not because it was invincible, but because it was adaptable in ways few societies have ever managed. Its genius was not in building perfect systems, but in accepting imperfect ones, long enough to make them work, then discarding them when they no longer did. That process, messy, violent, contradictory, allowed Rome to shape human history more profoundly than any empire before or since. Rome began as a marginal settlement with no clear destiny. It became a republic through resistance to kingship, then destroyed that republic in order to rule an empire, then abandoned imperial unity in the West to preserve civilization itself. At each stage, Rome responded not to ideals, but to pressure. When cooperation worked, Rome expanded citizenship. When competition became destructive, Rome centralized power. When centralization collapsed under its own weight, Rome fragmented. None of these outcomes were planned. All were reactions to conditions that made old solutions untenable. This is why Rome cannot be reduced to a moral lesson about decadence or decline. Ancient authors often framed Rome's transformation as a fall from virtue, but modern evidence tells a more complex story. Rome did not collapse because its people became lazy or corrupt. It collapsed in the West because the demands of empire exceeded the resources available to sustain it. Environmental strain, demographic pressure, military overstretch, and economic imbalance converged over centuries, gradually narrowing Rome's options. Collapse was not failure of will, it was the exhaustion of possibility. Yet even in exhaustion, Rome demonstrated resilience. Where imperial authority could no longer function, local structures took over. Law survived without emperors. Cities adapted to new rulers. Roman identity persisted without Roman rule. The Eastern Empire did not see itself as a successor, but as continuity itself, proving that Rome was never confined to one geography or political form. It was a system of ideas as much as a system of power. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Rome's legacy is how deeply it shaped the way later societies understood authority. Rome taught the world that law could be abstract, that governance could be bureaucratic, that legitimacy could be institutional rather than personal. Even when Rome disappeared politically, its assumptions remained embedded in how people thought about justice, order, and citizenship. The medieval world did not abandon Rome, it inherited it. Rome's story also reveals an uncomfortable truth about scale. The larger a system becomes, the more it depends on trust in structures rather than relationships. This allows expansion, but it also creates fragility. When institutions fail, recovery becomes harder because personal bonds are weaker. Rome's repeated crises illustrate this dynamic clearly. The Republic collapsed when competition outgrew its rules. The empire fractured when central authority outpaced local resilience. In both cases, scale magnified vulnerability. And yet, Rome's longevity suggests that collapse is not the opposite of success, but often its consequence. Rome succeeded so thoroughly that it created problems no previous society had faced. Governing millions across continents required innovations that no tradition could fully prepare for. Rome improvised solutions, and those solutions worked, sometimes for centuries. When they stopped working, Rome changed again. This pattern challenges modern assumptions about permanence. Rome was never stable in the sense of being fixed. It was stable because it was dynamic. Its greatest periods of endurance followed moments of reinvention. Augustus rebuilt Rome after civil war. Diocletian restructured it after near disintegration. Constantine redefined its identity entirely. Each transformation preserved continuity by abandoning outdated forms. The end of Rome in the West, often treated as a dramatic rupture, was in reality the slow release of pressure. Imperial authority faded because maintaining it demanded more than the West could supply. What followed was not chaos, but reorganization. Smaller political units emerged that better matched local realities. Roman civilization did not vanish, it decentralized. This realization reframes the meaning of Rome's fall. It was not the collapse of civilization, but the collapse of a specific administrative structure. Rome survived culturally because its influence had already diffused beyond the state itself. Roads still guided movement, laws still structured property, language still shaped thought. Even Rome's memory became a source of power invoked by kings, popes, and emperors who sought legitimacy through association. Why, then, does Rome continue to matter? Because it confronts humanity with the limits of control. Rome demonstrates that power can organize the world, but not freeze it, that institutions can manage complexity, but not eliminate change. That success creates new risks as surely as it creates opportunity. Rome's story endures because it mirrors the challenges faced by every large society that follows it. At the same time, Rome offers a profound lesson in endurance. Civilizations do not survive by avoiding crisis. They survive by responding to it honestly. Rome endured as long as it did because it was willing, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes violently, to change its form. When it could no longer sustain empire, it sustained culture. When it could no longer command territory, it commanded memory. In the end, Rome's true legacy is not a warning carved into ruins, but a reminder written into institutions, laws, and ideas that still shape the modern world. Rome shows us that civilizations are not immortal, but neither are they fragile in the way we often imagine. They bend, fracture, recombine, and endure in unexpected ways. Rome did not disappear. It transformed, and in doing so, it taught humanity how civilization survives. If Rome teaches anything with absolute clarity, it is that civilizations are not stories with neat endings. They are processes that spill beyond the boundaries historians later try to impose. Rome did not conclude with a final chapter marked "The End." It dissolved into the structures of the world that followed, becoming so thoroughly embedded in later societies that disentangling its influence is nearly impossible. In this sense, Rome's greatest achievement was not conquest, law, or architecture, but endurance through transformation. What made Rome unique was not simply its power, but its willingness to redefine what power meant. In the early Republic, power was competitive and collective, balanced through ritualized conflict. In the Empire, power became centralized and symbolic, concentrated in the figure of the emperor. In late antiquity, power fragmented into administrative, military, and religious forms that no single authority fully controlled. Each shift reflected an honest response to pressure. Rome did not cling to forms that no longer worked. It replaced them, even when doing so contradicted its own traditions. This capacity to abandon identity while preserving continuity is rare. Most civilizations collapse because they mistake form for essence. Rome survived because it instinctively understood the difference. When kings became unacceptable, Rome created a republic. When the republic could no longer manage empire, Rome accepted autocracy. When empire could no longer be unified, Rome decentralized. When political authority failed in the West, cultural authority endured through law, language, and religion. Rome did not insist on remaining the same, it insisted on remaining relevant. The irony is that Rome's most famous moments of strength often contained the seeds of future weakness. Expansion brought wealth, but also inequality. Centralization brought stability, but also rigidity. Standardization brought unity, but reduced local resilience. None of these outcomes were mistakes. They were trade-offs, accepted because alternatives seemed worse. Rome's decline was not caused by choosing the wrong path, but by exhausting every viable path available to it. This is why Rome's story resists moral judgment. It is neither a tragedy nor a triumph. It is a case study in complexity. Rome shows how success amplifies vulnerability, how solutions generate new problems, and how survival often depends on abandoning cherished ideals. These are uncomfortable lessons, but they are honest ones. Rome also challenges the idea that history progresses cleanly from one stage to another. The so-called fall of Rome in the West did not produce a vacuum. It produced continuity under new management. Roman law informed medieval justice. Roman infrastructure shaped settlement patterns. Roman identity provided legitimacy to new rulers who claimed to inherit its authority. Even those who rejected Rome could not escape its shadow. The Eastern Roman Empire understood this instinctively. It never called itself Byzantine. It called itself Roman. Its emperors ruled in Roman tradition, its laws were Roman law, and its identity was inseparable from Rome's past. This continuity lasted nearly 1,000 years after the West fragmented, proving that Rome's disappearance was not inevitable, only uneven. Rome's endurance also reframes how we think about collapse. Collapse is often imagined as a sudden, catastrophic event, but Rome demonstrates that collapse is usually a long negotiation between stress and adaptation. Systems bend, then break, then reform in new shapes. What matters is not avoiding collapse entirely, but managing it in ways that preserve what is essential. In this sense, Rome's greatest legacy is psychological. It teaches that loss is not the end of meaning, that failure of institutions does not equal failure of civilization, that people, not systems, carry culture forward. Rome survived because its people adapted, even when the structures around them did not. This perspective helps explain why Rome continues to dominate historical imagination. We do not return to Rome because it was perfect. We return because it was human. Its leaders were ambitious, fearful, brilliant, and flawed. Its citizens sought security, opportunity, and identity. Its institutions reflected the same tensions that define modern societies, between freedom and order, equality and efficiency, tradition and innovation. Rome's long arc forces humility. It reminds us that no society, no matter how advanced, is immune to change. But it also offers reassurance. Even when systems fail, civilization does not vanish. It transforms, recombines, and persists in forms that are often invisible to those living through the transition. In the end, Rome's story is not about ruins. It is about continuity without permanence, about influence without control, about survival without stability. Rome shows us that civilization is not a monument built once and preserved forever. It is a living process shaped by pressure, adaptation, and choice. Rome did not last because it was unbreakable. It lasted because it knew how to break without disappearing. And that is why, centuries after its emperors vanished and its legions marched no more, Rome still speaks, not as a warning from the past, but as a mirror held up to every civilization that follows. When Rome's full trajectory is placed alongside other civilizations that rose and vanished, its uniqueness becomes even more striking. Many societies achieved brilliance for brief moments, leaving behind art, architecture, or isolated innovations. Rome, by contrast, created a template for civilization itself, one that could be reused, adapted, and repurposed long after Roman power dissolved. This is why Rome never truly belonged to one era. It belonged to everyone who came after. What Rome perfected was not domination, but integration of systems. Law was not merely punishment, it was a framework for predictable life. Roads were not simply military tools, they were arteries of economic and cultural exchange. Cities were not just centers of power, they were nodes in a network that standardized experience across vast distances. Even when Rome fractured politically, these systems continued to function because they had become indispensable. This is where Rome differs fundamentally from empires built solely on force. When power vanished, their structures collapsed with it. When Roman power waned, its structures were inherited. Roman civilization proved transferable. That transferability is the true measure of its success. Yet Rome's endurance also exposes the limits of inheritance. Successor societies adopted Roman law and administration, but often lacked the scale and resources that had made them work originally. Fragmentation followed because Roman systems were designed for an empire, not a patchwork of kingdoms. Medieval Europe struggled for centuries to reconcile Roman ideals with local realities, producing hybrid systems that were neither fully Roman nor entirely new. This tension shaped the development of Western political thought. Rome became an aspiration rather than a reality, an imagined standard of order invoked whenever authority needed justification. Kings styled themselves emperors. Popes claimed Roman legitimacy. Even revolutionary movements framed themselves in Roman terms, borrowing language of republic, senate, and citizenship. Rome's power lived on as symbolism as much as substance. The persistence of Roman symbolism reveals another truth. Rome succeeded because it understood narrative. From its founding myths to imperial propaganda, Rome told stories about itself that justified power, sacrifice, and endurance. These stories evolved as Rome evolved. When Rome was a republic, it celebrated civic virtue. When it was an empire, it celebrated peace and order. When it was Christian, it celebrated divine purpose. Each narrative made survival feel meaningful. Narrative did not prevent collapse, but it shaped how collapse was experienced. Rome's transformations were traumatic, but they were rarely interpreted as meaningless. People understood change as part of continuity. This psychological resilience mattered as much as administrative reform. Rome's ability to survive crises repeatedly also depended on its tolerance for contradiction. It accepted inequality while preaching citizenship. It centralized power while preserving republican forms. It expanded while claiming restraint. These contradictions were not accidental. They were compromises that allowed Rome to function longer than purist systems ever could. But compromise has a cost. Over time, contradictions accumulated faster than they could be resolved. The late empire became increasingly coercive because consent was harder to sustain. Taxation grew heavier. Social mobility narrowed. Local autonomy diminished. These measures preserved order, but drained loyalty. When pressure finally exceeded capacity, fragmentation followed. And yet, even fragmentation did not erase Rome. It scattered it. Roman law survived in courts. Roman language survived in Latin and its descendants. Roman urban planning survived in medieval cities. Roman ideas of citizenship, governance, and legitimacy survived in political theory. Rome ceased to exist as a single entity, but it became omnipresent as influence. This diffusion explains why Rome feels both distant and familiar. We recognize its structures even when we reject its values. We inherit its systems even when we critique its power. Rome's legacy is not static. It is contested, reinterpreted, and reshaped by every generation. Perhaps the most important lesson Rome offers is that civilization is not defined by uninterrupted stability, but by the ability to recover meaning after disruption. Rome endured plagues, invasions, economic collapse, and political violence. It survived not by preventing these crises, but by absorbing them into new forms. This perspective reframes modern fears of collapse. Rome reminds us that endings are rarely absolute. They are transitions whose significance becomes clear only in hindsight. What feels like disintegration may be reorganization. What looks like failure may be adaptation under constraint. Rome's story ultimately challenges us to reconsider what success looks like across centuries. Is success eternal dominance or lasting influence? Is it preservation of form or survival of function? By those measures, Rome remains one of the most successful civilizations in human history. As we approach the final part of this documentary, the focus narrows to one essential insight. Rome's greatness did not lie in avoiding collapse. It lay in shaping the world so thoroughly that collapse could not erase it. In the final section, we will bring this insight to its fullest expression, offering a concluding reflection on why Rome still matters, not as history frozen in time, but as a living framework that continues to shape how humanity understands power, continuity, and change. As Rome's influence diffused across continents and centuries, something remarkable happened. The civilization outlived its own memory of being fragile. Later societies looked back at Rome not as an experiment that nearly failed, but as a monolith that must have been inevitable. This illusion of inevitability is one of Rome's most misleading legacies. In reality, Rome's survival was never guaranteed at any stage of its history. It endured because people responded to crisis with adaptation rather than denial, even when those adaptations contradicted deeply held traditions. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Roman endurance is the role of crisis itself. Rome did not survive because it avoided catastrophe. It survived because catastrophe forced change that stability would never have allowed. Civil wars destroyed the Republic, but they also exposed its limits. The 3rd century crisis nearly shattered the empire, but it made reform unavoidable. The loss of the western provinces weakened imperial authority, but it allowed Roman culture to decentralize and persist in new forms. Rome's history suggests that long periods of comfort are often more dangerous than moments of disruption. This pattern challenges the assumption that strong institutions alone guarantee survival. Rome possessed extraordinary institutions, but those institutions only endured when people were willing to reshape them. When institutions became rigid, collapse followed. When they were reimagined, continuity emerged. Rome's adaptability was not institutional at first. It was human. Individuals made decisions under pressure, choosing compromise over purity, pragmatism over nostalgia. Rome's relationship with power illustrates this tension clearly. Power was never static in Rome. It moved from kings to magistrates, from senate to generals, from emperors to bureaucracies, from state to church. At each stage, power was redistributed rather than erased. This redistribution allowed authority to persist even as its form changed. Where other civilizations tied legitimacy to a single structure, Rome allowed legitimacy to migrate. This migration of legitimacy explains why Rome could be both absent and present at the same time. The Western Empire vanished, yet Roman law governed medieval courts. Roman emperors disappeared, yet Roman titles legitimized kings. Roman paganism faded, yet Roman administrative logic shaped Christian institutions. Rome became an inheritance rather than a regime. What makes this inheritance so enduring is that Rome solved problems that never stopped existing. How do you govern diverse populations? How do you standardize law across cultures? How do you balance local autonomy with central authority? How do you maintain order without constant violence? Rome never solved these questions permanently, but it produced workable answers that later societies reused, modified, and sometimes rejected. Rome became a reference point for possibility. At the same time, Rome's failures became warnings embedded in historical memory. Overextension, concentration of wealth, militarization of politics, and reliance on exceptional leaders recur throughout Roman history. These were not moral failings unique to Rome. They were structural risks inherent to scale. Rome's experience reveals that complexity amplifies consequences. Small mistakes in large systems produce outsized effects. Rome survived as long as it did because it corrected mistakes before they became irreversible, though not always in time. The endurance of Rome's ideas also owes much to education and memory. Roman texts were copied, studied, and debated long after imperial collapse. Writers like Livy, Tacitus, and Cicero shaped how later generations understood politics, virtue, and power. Their works ensured that Rome remained intellectually alive, not just archaeologically present. Even criticism of Rome reinforced its centrality. To argue against Rome was to acknowledge its importance. This continuous engagement with Rome transformed it from history into framework. Rome became less about what happened and more about how to think. Renaissance humanists turned to Rome to imagine civic virtue. Enlightenment thinkers studied Rome to debate liberty and authority. Modern political systems borrowed Roman terminology because it carried weight accumulated over millennia. Rome became a shared language for power. Yet Rome's story also resists appropriation. No single era has been able to claim Rome entirely. Monarchs emphasized imperial authority. Republicans emphasized civic participation. Theologians emphasized Christian continuity. Each interpretation highlights one aspect while ignoring others. This multiplicity is not confusion. It is evidence of Rome's complexity. Rome cannot be reduced to a single lesson because it was never a single thing. Perhaps the most important insight Rome offers is that survival does not require purity. Rome was inconsistent, contradictory, and often hypocritical. It preached equality while enforcing hierarchy. It celebrated peace while relying on war. It valued tradition while constantly changing. These contradictions did not destroy Rome. They allowed it to function across vastly different conditions. This does not mean Rome was invulnerable. It means vulnerability was managed rather than denied. Rome's ultimate transformation was not graceful or planned, but it was effective. Civilization continued because people adjusted expectations and redefined success. They stopped asking how to preserve Rome exactly as it had been and started asking how to preserve what mattered. As we move closer to the final parts of this documentary, one idea becomes unavoidable. Rome's greatest achievement was not domination of territory, but domination of time. Few civilizations have remained relevant for so long, not because they lasted unchanged, but because they mattered differently in every era that followed. In the next part, we will narrow this perspective even further, asking what Rome's long history reveals about humanity itself, and why the Roman experience continues to resonate in a world that still grapples with scale, power, identity, and change. When Rome's story is stripped of names, dates, and monuments, what remains is a record of how human societies respond when success pushes them beyond familiar limits. Rome did not collapse because it was uniquely flawed. It collapsed in certain forms because it was uniquely successful. It expanded farther, governed more people, and endured longer than any political system before it. And in doing so, it encountered pressures no tradition had prepared it to face. Rome's experience reveals that the greatest threat to a civilization is not weakness, but scale without reinvention. One of Rome's most revealing characteristics was its willingness to accept gradual transformation rather than demand dramatic solutions. Rome rarely solved problems cleanly. Instead, it tolerated inefficiency, contradiction, and compromise for long periods, buying time until deeper changes became unavoidable. This incremental approach allowed Rome to absorb shocks that would have shattered more rigid systems. It also delayed necessary reform, creating crises that eventually forced more radical restructuring. Rome survived not because it chose the correct path early, but because it kept paths open. This flexibility was cultural as much as political. Roman identity was never fixed. It evolved from tribal affiliation to civic membership, from ethnic belonging to legal status, from pagan ritual to Christian faith. Each transformation redefined who could belong without erasing continuity entirely. Rome did not require uniformity of belief or origin. It required participation in shared systems. This inclusive framework allowed Roman civilization to persist even when Roman power did not. At the same time, Rome's adaptability had limits. When systems became too complex to manage through trust and tradition, coercion replaced consent. Late Roman administration relied heavily on surveillance, taxation, and military enforcement. These measures preserved order in the short term, but weakened long-term loyalty. People complied because they had to, not because they believed. When pressure increased further, compliance gave way to fragmentation. Rome's experience demonstrates that order maintained through force alone is stable only while resources last. The Western Empire reached that limit first. Its agricultural base, demographic structure, and frontier pressures made sustained central authority increasingly impractical. Rather than collapse into chaos, Western society reorganized into smaller political units that better matched local conditions. Authority became personal rather than institutional. Roman governance gave way to Roman influence. This was not regression, but recalibration. The Eastern Empire, by contrast, maintained sufficient resources and administrative density to preserve centralized authority. Its survival shows that Rome did not fall because imperial rule was inherently unsustainable, but because sustainability depended on context. Where economic integration, urban life, and defensible geography persisted, Roman structures endured. Where they did not, Rome adapted by decentralizing itself. This distinction matters because it reframes the idea of inevitability. Rome's end was not preordained, it was contingent. Different choices, different environments, or different pressures could have produced different outcomes. Rome teaches us that history is not governed by destiny, but by accumulation of conditions. Rome's long arc also challenges the way we measure progress. Modern societies often equate advancement with innovation and novelty. Rome advanced through continuity as much as invention. Its most effective tools, law, administration, infrastructure, were refined slowly over centuries rather than created suddenly. This patience allowed Rome to scale without losing coherence, but it also made adaptation harder when rapid change was required. Rome excelled at gradual improvement, not abrupt transformation. This tension between gradualism and urgency appears repeatedly in Roman history. The Republic delayed reform until violence forced it. The Empire delayed restructuring until near collapse demanded it. Each delay increased the cost of change, but also ensured that change, when it came, was decisive. Rome did not reform lightly, but when it did, it transformed completely. Rome's legacy therefore resists simple application. It does not offer a blueprint for success. It offers a record of trade-offs. Every Roman solution created new problems. Every adaptation preserved some values while sacrificing others. Rome endured because it accepted loss as the price of survival. Perhaps the most profound lesson Rome offers is about memory. Rome survived because it was remembered, taught, and invoked. Its stories shaped identity long after its institutions vanished. Memory became a form of power. By controlling how Rome was remembered, later societies shaped how authority was justified. Rome lived on not only in structures, but in imagination. This imaginative survival explains why Rome continues to provoke debate. It can be interpreted as a warning against overreach or as a testament to endurance. It can be seen as a story of decline or of transformation. These interpretations coexist because Rome was all of these things at once. It was neither a golden age nor a cautionary tale alone. It was a lived experiment in civilization. As we approach the final part of this documentary, one realization becomes unavoidable. Rome matters not because it answers history's questions, but because it asks them so clearly. How long can complex systems endure? How much inequality can cohesion survive? How do societies adapt when traditions fail? Rome confronted these questions across centuries, leaving behind evidence rather than solutions. In the final section, we will bring this reflection to its ultimate conclusion, examining why Rome's story remains essential not just to understanding the past, but to understanding how civilizations navigate uncertainty, change, and survival in every era that follows. When Rome's long story finally settles into perspective, what remains is not the image of a fallen empire, but of a civilization that refused to end neatly. Rome did not disappear in fire or silence. It dissolved slowly into the structures of the world that followed, shaping them so deeply that even centuries later, its presence is felt in law, language, governance, and belief. Rome's ultimate achievement was not conquest, but continuity beyond control. Rome teaches us that civilizations are not destroyed when they change. They are destroyed when they cannot. Every major transformation in Roman history, monarchy to republic, republic to empire, empire to fragmentation, was not a betrayal of Rome's identity, but an attempt to preserve what mattered under new conditions. Rome did not survive by defending tradition at all costs. It survived by sacrificing tradition when necessary. This willingness to abandon form while preserving function is rare. Most societies collapse because they confuse identity with structure. Rome avoided this trap longer than any civilization before it. When the Senate lost power, law remained. When emperors vanished, administration endured. When imperial authority collapsed in the West, Roman culture lived on through the church, through legal systems, through the very way people imagined order itself. Rome did not require an emperor to exist. It required memory, structure, and adaptation. Rome's failures are inseparable from its achievements. The same expansion that brought wealth created inequality. The same centralization that brought stability produced rigidity. The same institutions that governed millions struggled to evolve fast enough when conditions changed. Rome did not fall because it was immoral or decadent. It fractured because complexity eventually outpaced adaptability. And yet even then, it did not vanish. It redistributed itself. This is why Rome resists simple lessons. It is not merely a warning about overreach, nor a celebration of endurance. It is a study in trade-offs. Every solution Rome found created new vulnerabilities. Every reform preserved some values while abandoning others. Rome endured not because it solved history's problems, but because it managed them longer than anyone else. Rome also exposes a truth that modern societies often avoid. Stability is not the default state of civilization. It is an achievement that must be constantly renegotiated. Rome's long peace under the early empire was not permanent. It was purchased through military dominance, administrative efficiency, and social compromise. When those mechanisms weakened, peace faded. Rome's decline was not sudden because its problems were not sudden. They accumulated quietly over generations until transformation became unavoidable. Yet within this reality lies something deeply reassuring. Rome shows us that collapse is rarely total. What collapses are systems, not people. Authority, not culture. Structures, not meaning. When Rome's Western Empire ended, life did not stop. It reorganized. Roman civilization persisted in new forms because people carried it forward, adapting it to realities imperial systems could no longer manage. This reframes how we understand endings. Rome's end was not a failure of humanity, but an expression of its resilience. The people who lived through Rome's transformations did not experience the end of civilization. They experienced change, often painful, often disorienting, but survivable. Civilization continued because humans adjusted expectations and rebuilt meaning. Rome's story endures because it mirrors the challenges every complex society faces. Growth creates strain. Success creates inequality. Stability breeds rigidity. Adaptation becomes harder the longer systems persist. Rome encountered these challenges earlier and at greater scale than any society before it, leaving behind not solutions, but evidence. Evidence of what works temporarily. Evidence of what eventually fails. Evidence of how survival unfolds when permanence is no longer possible. And perhaps this is why Rome continues to matter so deeply. Not because it offers comfort, but because it offers clarity. Rome reminds us that no civilization is eternal, but also that no civilization truly disappears. Influence outlives authority. Memory outlasts power. Meaning survives structure. Rome did not dominate the world forever. It shaped how the world understands domination. It did not preserve unity indefinitely. It taught humanity how unity fragments and reforms. It did not escape collapse. It demonstrated how collapse can become transformation rather than oblivion. In the end, Rome's greatest legacy is not found in ruins, but in the frameworks we still use to organize life, in courts of law, in systems of governance, in concepts of citizenship and legitimacy, in the very idea that civilization can persist beyond the fall of its institutions. Rome was not immortal, but it mastered something far more difficult. It mastered survival through change. And that is why, long after its emperors are gone and its legions silent, Rome still speaks, not as a voice from the past, but as a guide through the enduring challenge of civilization itself.